Good afternoon, everyone. I'm coming at you live with another video. Today we're going to be installing Windows 95 and playing some games. Now, this is a lesser part of a bigger project I've been planning for a few months at this point, I'd say, where I want to create a 1997 workstation for 2D and 3D rendering. Something that I've wanted to do for some time. I just haven't had the money to build it physically. So we're going to be doing this in the 86-box emulator. It's an excellent solution for this sort of thing because it has really good custom hardware options, which is what we're going to need to actually complete the setup. And yeah, so here's the basic setup. We've got a Intel Pentium Pro clocked at 150 megahertz. More on that later. This is a very interesting processor for what it is. Got a Matrox Millennium 2 as the graphics card with 8 megabytes of VRAM. And sound card, we've got two actually. We've got our AWE64 Gold, that's classic. And then our Sound Blaster 16, that's because the Sound Blaster 16 has a better FM chip. It has an actual OPL3 by Yamaha. It's a very beloved sound chip. Pretty much like defined the early era of DOS gaming, and it's really fun to make music with it, at least for me. So that's why that's there. It's for Windows 95 primarily because there's a specific program I want to use in 95 that only runs in DOS, and Windows NT doesn't have very good compatibility. So yeah, we got our network card. We've currently got a Realtek in there. I'm actually going to replace that with the NE2000 because the Realtek has issues and 95 doesn't quite work correctly. So storage controllers, we're just gonna go with IDE for this setup. Right now I have it on the SCSI bus, so I'm just gonna switch that over to IDE real quick and gonna make sure we have the correct read and write speed. We're gonna go with 5400 RPM because that's period correct to the time. We're going to go with one ATAPI CD-ROM drive at 12 speed. We're going to do our dual floppy setup here. That was pretty common among workstations. And yeah, so we're going to be installing Windows 95 this episode. NT 4.0 is the primary operating system, but you want to install that second if you're going to dual boot like I am, because it installs its own bootloader, and what it'll do is it'll recognize that Windows 95 is already installed, and it'll add its own entry for NT without removing the bootloader for 95. So if you're going to dual boot like I am, you want to install 95 first. But yeah, so anyways, we're going to set up the system here. We're just going to get the system started up, and I'm just going to check the BIOS real quick, just in case I missed anything. I think I have it all set up correctly, but shit, sometimes I miss things. So this computer is pretty advanced for its time. In terms of what we're emulating, it has a 150 megahertz Pentium Pro. That's a workstation CPU primarily, so it really works best in Windows NT. But more on that later because that's a little bit complicated and beyond the scope of what I want to do in this video. And of course the motherboard, it is a multi-processor capable motherboard, but 86-box does not support multiple CPUs at this moment. So we've only got a single 150 megahertz Pentium Pro in there, and we might upgrade that later depending on if our needs require it. One thing that has occurred to me actually is 512 megs of RAM is too much for 95, so we're going to drop that to 480 before we continue, because I can tell you right now, having more than 480 is going to be a problem. So you'll run into weird issues where it just like won't install correctly and stuff like that. So anyways, I'm just going to grab my 98 boot disk. Where did I save that? Now it sees it as 480 megabytes. That's honestly way more than enough for 95, and that's even a lot for NT4. In order to have a decent experience with NT4, you could honestly get away with 64. But because we're going to be doing like 3D rendering tasks and like 2D rendering and video production potentially, the extra RAM will actually be helpful. So But again, in this video, I don't want to get too much into that because I know that's going to be a more complicated endeavor. But I'll explain the basics today. So while this boots up, I'll kind of explain what my plan is. I've got a 20 gig primary hard disk in there, and also a 20 gig backup, right? Because you want that in a workstation. Basically, what the plan is, 2 gigabytes is going to be reserved for 95, which is going to be formatted as FAT16 because NT4 cannot read FAT32, and so yeah, this, as you can see right now, it's asking me if I want to enable large disk support. We don't want that because NT4 4 is not going to be able to see the 95 partition. So we're going to format this as FAT16, primary DOS partition. I guess there's already one on there. Really? Okay, we're going to delete that just so we can go through the process. Yeah, that's fine. And this is going to take a little while because we are off IDE. Originally, I was planning to do this with SCSI, which is why all the menu options were selected as SCSI. The problem with that is SCSI emulation, at least with hard disks, seems to be a bit bugged in 86-box in terms of affecting the emulation speed. So we're going to go with IDE for now. I might install a SCSI controller later, and we'll just use that for the CD-ROM because that can actually make quite a big difference in terms of read speeds. As far as that goes, on an actual system, once I have the money and time to actually like build this system physically, I will install a SCSI controller because that was more typical of workstations of the day. Most of them didn't run IDE. IDE was more of a consumer level setup. But anyways, now that we've partitioned the hard disk, we're gonna restart our computer. Yeah, basically what I did there is I just formatted the partition as FAT16, which has a maximum of 2 gigabytes typically, and it is limited to 4 partitions on an 8 gig drive. But yeah, that's really all you need to know about that. That's not going to come up again any other time. So we're just going to reboot. This is floppy speed, so it will take a little while to get going here, but once it does, okay, cool. So we're back up. Now let's go ahead and type format C. That should do that. Yes. And format that, the 2 gigabytes we installed. This is going to take probably, I'm going to guess like 5 minutes or so. I guess while that's completing, before I do my cutaways, so you don't have to sit through all of this, I'm going to kind of explain what the plan is for today in better detail. So we're formatting this as FAT16, as I said. We're going to be installing Windows 95C, aka the last version of 95. We're going to make sure the hardware is all working correctly. We're going to get the video card working. We're going to get all our drivers set up, so that's all working as it should. And once that is all set up, I'm going to make sure that the Voodoo card I also have attached to the Matrox is working, because that's what we're going to be used for playing games. That's why we're dual booting primarily between 95 and NT. NT is actually fine if the game is using OpenGL or just like Direct Draw or whatever, or very early versions of DirectX. NT is absolutely fine because it supports all those. But officially, NT4 only supports up to DirectX 3, I think. You can unofficially get 5 and 6 working, although you're limited to software rendering with that, so it's not really ideal. 95, if memory serves, supports up to DirectX 8, I think. So that gives us much better compatibility. Now, we're not going to be running any DirectX 8 games, I think, because you got to keep in mind the hardware from 1997. This is back when hardware moved much faster and computers were always evolving, and so a system that would have been considered top of the line in 1995 would have been almost completely obsolete in like 2001, 2002. In terms of playing like the latest games and running the latest software, it wouldn't be a very good experience. But that's not really the point of this. We're not trying to like have a super awesome modern computer here. We're trying to recreate a very specific era of computing, one that's mostly forgotten. Most people don't cover the workstation and computer-aided design sort of area of computing, especially from this era. It's mostly forgotten, and a lot of the software hasn't been archived. So I kind of want to bring that to light, and I don't know, man. I think it'd be fun for us to explore stuff like 3D modeling and graphing and video editing, and how kind of see how it was from that time period. And also in the process, we can explore Windows NT 4 and see how far we can take it. Between the two operating systems, NT4 is one I much prefer over 95 overall, because 95 is just not very resource efficient, and it's not very stable either, especially once you get to a certain point with your hardware. Like, the faster you get, and once you get to certain motherboards and stuff, 95 just has issues. 95 is very picky and particular about its hardware. All the conditions need to be met, or you start running into problems. So you might be wondering why I didn't just quick format this. The thing is, you actually can't do that with a fresh disk that hasn't been formatted before. Now, what makes this ridiculous is the reason why this format is taking so long is because it's doing a drive integrity. It's basically writing zeros to the whole disk, or at least the 2 GB partition we set up. And while it's doing that, it's verifying the hard disk to make sure it's working correctly. Now, this makes sense on an actual drive with physical hardware, but because we're doing emulation, there is literally no way that this disk would have read errors, because it's just a virtual VHD file. So that's what makes this a little bit silly and ridiculous, but hey, what are you gonna do? It's part of the experience, right? If we really want to recreate the experience of sitting through this crap, like so many people did back in the day, this is what you did. And it's unfortunate that we can't use SCSI, because SCSI would speed up this process significantly. But it is what it is. Yeah, just to clear up the confusion, we are using a 98 second edition boot disk to install 95, because they are completely compatible for all intents and purposes. But the difference is 98 boot disks tend to be more reliable, and they tend to have more tools and stuff. So now at this point, we can actually insert the CD. F? Okay, there it is. Yeah, we have multiple drives connected, so that can get a little bit confusing. But yeah, I guess drive F is our CD-ROM. So we're just gonna run setup.exe, and that should work. Okay, perfect. I haven't formatted the backup drive yet, because that's going to be formatted as NTFS once we have NT4 installed. Ooh, of course, the EULA. Can't wait to not read all of this. Now, I don't know how many of you have watched Windows 95 setup videos. I imagine not many of you, because I mean, unless you're into retro nerd stuff like I am, you probably don't care that much. So yeah, I am going to skip through some of this more boring stuff that I know people aren't going to care about. Oh, that's right. I need the product key. Sure, we'll just have it look for it. Yes, we have both of those. I did manually set the interrupt request in DMA on the Sound Blaster 16. It shouldn't detect the AWE 64 Gold at all, because it doesn't have built-in drivers for that. Which is what I want, because I'm not going to be using it in 95. I'm going to be using the Sound Blaster 16. The AWE 64 Gold is for Windows NT, because it has more advanced MIDI capabilities. With the 16, you're limited to FM synthesis, of course. But the AWE 64 Gold can do sound fonts, and I have 28 megs of RAM on that, which is the maximum you can have for it. And so you can actually load decently sized sound fonts with that. And that'll come in handy for music production and stuff like that when we get NT4 installed. But that's going to be a little while from now. Maybe part 1, we'll see. I'm calling this part 0 since it's almost like a prologue in a way. One thing I do like about these older Windows versions is they have like these cool graphics that you don't really see anymore. It's cool, and it's kind of impressive when you consider that all this stuff is done with only 16 colors. Not 16-bit color, 16 colors. That's it. That's their entire color palette. And there's something kind of charming about 16-color artwork. It's pretty impressive what they're able to do with it when you think about it. This is actually going much quicker than I expected it to. This can honestly take forever depending on how many devices you have. Okay, here we go. So detected my Net Anywhere 2000, which is expected. It was an extremely common network card. But we do, of course, need to install the TCP over IP protocol, because that's going to give us internet access for stuff like... no. We don't need to start up this for 95. I'm just going to be careful with it. Yep, I expected this to happen. This just seems to happen every time I try to install this. You can hit ignore. It's safe. Yeah, again, just hit ignore if that happens. It's typically fine. It seems to install just fine. Now, funny thing about 95, or irritating, depending on who you ask, it's extremely particular about its hardware. It's a picky little bitch. If the conditions aren't perfect, it just doesn't work correctly or doesn't install correctly. This is one of the ways that Windows 98 drastically improved the consumer Windows experience, 98 Second Edition in particular. Now, that might raise the question of, well, then why aren't you installing 98 SE? Isn't it a much better operating system? You'd be correct. It is improved over 95 in pretty much every way. However, at least with 86 box, I've had some emulation issues with 98 SE. It emulates fine, like it works correctly, but whenever there's heavy disk activity, the emulation speed just drops drastically to like the 50-60% range, and that's not really good enough. So we're going to stick with 95 and NT4, because I know that those will emulate at full speed pretty much all the time, at least enough to where it's usable. Now, a lot of that is, of course, down to the processor we are emulating, that 150 MHz Pentium Pro. Now, this is a very advanced processor, as I said. It is a workstation processor, and it's not well optimized for Windows 9X, so 95, 98. It's not a great choice for that, because it has a 32-bit architecture, and both of these operating systems have a lot of 16-bit dependencies, especially 95. And it's not as well optimized for that compared to a typical Pentium Classic, or especially Pentium MMX. But I've tested this before off camera. It is perfectly usable. And as far as gaming performance goes, it will probably be roughly the same, because the fact is, back in the 90s, the number one important thing was clock rate and the performance you got per clock. So 150 megahertz, if you had that in 1997, you were in pretty good shape. It wasn't like top of the line. That'd be more like 200-ish. And we might upgrade the CPU later if 150 isn't enough. But honestly, for now, I think that'll be a good baseline for us. This is actually going a bit quicker than I expected. We might actually be done with the initial installation within 5-10 minutes or so, which would be great. This is one of those things where, depending on your CPU, this could take much, much longer. 115 megahertz is pretty comfortable for 95. You can technically get away with much lower. I mean, shit, 95 technically will install in a 386 running at 33 megahertz. But I highly recommend you don't do that unless you're a masochist. Because let me tell you from experience, 95 on a 386 is not what I would call smooth, or fast, or responsive. It works in the same way that a $200 laptop will get you online. It'll do the job, but you could do much better. So once this completes, the first thing I'm going to do is take out the CD. Because 95C, or OSR 2.5, when it finishes installing, it will immediately try to install Internet Explorer 4, which isn't a problem, but it doesn't let you customize the options. So it also forces you to install the desktop update. Now, some people love that. For me personally, I hate it. For 95 and NT, it just makes there are certain advantages, like there's extra shortcuts for things, but as far as like file browsing goes, it really slows everything down. It's not great, and I don't like how it has a web integration with File Explorer. I think that's the dumbest thing. It should work fine. We shouldn't have any issues. It worked perfectly fine on the last setup I tested. This is taking a bit longer than I anticipated, but we still have some hard drive activities, so we're good. Just as a rule of thumb, if that light goes out and it's not doing anything, you should probably restart your computer. But no, it looks fine. Sure. I don't really know how that happened, but okay. Yeah, we don't. I guess we'll put it in password. Yeah, I'm gonna assume that that's an IRQ conflict. That can be resolved in Device Manager. By default, it chooses IRQ3, which is probably fine for some stuff. I tend to go with IRQ9 or 10 if I can, within the emulator options. It probably picked some default that I thought it would use. Like a lot of cases, a lot of network cards would default to IRQ3, which is fine for most setups, but I tend to go with 9 just in case I need to use the COM port. So this should not take very long at all. I'm going to say like 2 minutes at most. Although I think we need to reboot again after this. That's the other fun part about the 90s era of Windows. It's constant reboots. Even on NT. You still reboot a lot, although not as much as 95. Yeah, actually that is correct. You must install a printer before you can print from your computer. We are not going to be doing that. Okay, cool. We have sound working, but there's a weird crackling issue. Let me investigate that real quick. Yeah, I've never seen that before, that crackling issue. Once this boots up and we're actually up and running, I'm going to take a look at Device Manager and see what's causing that. It shouldn't detect the AWE64 at all because it doesn't have plug-and-play drivers for that out of the box, but I don't know. Yeah, that I expected, so that's not unusual. Okay. Yeah, unknown device, that's probably what it's trying to pick up right now. Okay, let's investigate whatever that issue is. That is weird. I've never seen that before. Device Manager. Primary IDE controller. Okay. Uh-huh. Yeah, this is the issue we're having. Let's see. Let's go to properties, drivers. I think our best bet is just going to be to disable that, because that's going to... No. Because that's going to cause problems. Disable. No. PCI Universal Serial Bus, that's going to be the motherboard. The VSX, or VS for 40FX, which is the motherboard we have. It's an Intel motherboard. That doesn't have great support in 95. It has drivers, but it's a little bit of a pain. Does it detect the CD-ROM drive? That is a CD-ROM, isn't it? The device attached to the system is not functioning. What? Let's see if that fixes our crackling issue. What we just did there. We basically disabled the AW64. So I guess it still picked it up somehow, like it recognized that something was there, but it couldn't find the drivers. That honestly comes as a shock to me, but whatever. 95 is weird, man. This is why I wanted to install 98, because you don't have as many of these weird issues. Now, I will fully admit I kind of set myself up for weirdness by having 2 sound cards installed. That's kind of a weird setup in general. Like on actual hardware, I don't think you'd want to do that typically, but whatever. Yep, that's fine. No, it's still doing that, dude. God, that is awful. Okay, yeah, so I swapped the sound card for the plug-and-play version so it can sort that out by itself. We'll see if it does that correctly. It's actually probably going to need to restart after this. I'm trying to think, could it be the DMA channel assignment I have? Well, but no, I installed the plug-and-play version. That should automatically configure that. Yeah, it's the same problem. Okay. Here's what we're going to do. It could be a number of things. Real quick, I just want to make sure the CD-ROM drive is working, because sometimes, even if you have IDE, it just won't work correctly. So, let's refresh. Yeah, that is probably because of the motherboard. Drive is not being present. So, okay. So, we've got plenty of problems to resolve here today. First one we're going to do, I'm just going to remove the Sound Blaster 16 from the equation, because it's probably causing us problems. So we shouldn't have any sound anymore. Nope. Perfect. That's exactly what I wanted. Okay, so first thing, we're going to go to Device Manager. Set configuration manually. Interrupt request. Yeah, it tells you that it's conflicting, but instead of resolving it itself, it doesn't. So, 9. There we go. That should fix the Ethernet. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, I guess it wants me to turn off the computer? That's weird. I'm just going to hard reset. Yeah, if you're not using those COM ports, IRQ3 is fine, but I just don't want to have any conflict. And so IRQ9 is a safe bet, because I can't imagine I'm going to be using anything else that needs that interrupt request. So, okay. So, now that we have that sorted out, what it's detecting this right here is the other hard disk we have installed that has not been formatted. I think what's going on is it knows there's a hard drive, but it's not formatted, so it can't read it. That's my best guess. But regardless, we are going to find that driver and try to install the motherboard stuff. Now, this should, in theory, give us CD-ROM support. It's weird, because honestly, it's an IDE driver. It should be able to detect it no problem, but it just doesn't. Another reason why I just... Ugh. Yeah, I have a love-hate relationship for 95, because you run into weird crap like this that isn't an issue in 98 as much, so... Yeah, it's going to modify the INF. That makes sense. Okay. Alright. PCI IDE controller. Perfect. Hopefully that works, because we're not going to be able to do much without CD-ROM support. Yeah, and like I said, it's all reboots. So we're going to see the screen a million more times, but I'm going to cut out the boring stuff you're not going to care about as much as I can. But part of this is I want to have you guys see the sort of weird crap you run into with older Windows, and why it's a pain in the ass sometimes, because it's important to understand so you appreciate how much more straightforward this has gotten over the years. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Do we have our CD-ROM? We do not. Why the fuck not? Properties. Device Manager. I mean, it had it for the installation. You saw it. So why can I not see the CD-ROM now? Okay. So it just turns out I am a goddamn idiot. I somehow managed to put the primary hard disk on slave and installed it that way. And at the same time, I also somehow managed to have the CD-ROM drive listed as slave within 86 box, which is weird because, as you remember from the BIOS detection, it could detect both just fine, despite them being on the same port. So whatever. Point is, it's working now. I have the primary hard disk on slave, which is stupid. That shouldn't cause issues because most software doesn't care. In the case of 95, it installed on slave, no yeah, Slave, no problem. I imagine they'll be the same way with NT, but whatever. Doesn't make it any less stupid. So, anyways, we have the system set up. It's working. That was the point of this first part of the video. The next step is the fun part, of course, where we have to get the video driver installed, the audio driver, and then we'll try to play some games. So, yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and get that set up, and I'll cut back once we have the system ready to go. Okay, so it's been about a week, give or take. I've been busy. Yeah, I've just been troubleshooting some miscellaneous problems. Before we get into the games and other random stuff I've installed, I do kind of want to briefly touch on what I basically did here. I ended up going for sound. As I said I would, I just went with the Sound Blaster AW64 Gold, just because I thought it would be more simple. And, there is a difference between the actual OPL3 and the emulated version with this card, but it's close enough for all intents and purposes for what I need to do. It'll get the job done, right? And so yeah, we've got that. We've got our Voodoo 3D accelerator here. I was able to find the drivers to that, no problem. And of course, our primary display adapter is the Matrox Millennium 2, which is working just as it should. And yeah, in a nutshell, what I basically ended up doing was reinstalling Windows just with the proper master-slave configuration. Because before, I was having an issue where it would keep trying to find the operating system on slave, which is, problematic. Typically with your CD-ROM and hard drive configuration, you're going to have your hard drive on master and your CD on slave. At least that's generally how it goes. But anyways, it's been reinstalled. It all seems to work. Sound works, video works, it should. We're all good there. But yeah, so the main reason why I wanted to install Windows 95 was for gaming, right? For all the games that won't run on NT. Yeah, for certain DirectX games especially that won't run correctly in NT4 or at all, because it only officially supports up to DirectX 3. 95 is definitely the way to go, because we get up to DirectX 8, I believe is the last version, so much better app support. But yeah, so we've got Tempest 2000 here. This is an awesome game. I highly recommend you play it if you haven't already. Oh yeah. This game has a great soundtrack, dude. But yeah, so for all intents and purposes, this runs great, just as it should. Music works correctly, no emulation speed issues. Frame rate seems fine. It's hovering around the 30 range with occasional drops, which is perfectly acceptable for this game. If you've heard of Tempest 2000, you typically associate it with the Atari Jaguar version, I imagine. The Windows version is actually better in a lot of ways, so I wanted to install it because I knew it would be a good test for the Pentium Pro. As it's not really being well utilized in Windows 95, because again, it's a 16-bit operating system primarily, but I don't know, man, it seems to be running good here, so yeah. But yeah, you get the idea. Yeah, it's a great game, honestly. I recommend you check it out if you ever get the chance. But yeah, the other game I wanted to set up the system for is Duke Nukem 3D. It's another classic. I've set it so it prompts you to reboot into MS-DOS mode, simply because performance is better if you run it within DOS rather than on top of Windows. Pretty much the main reason why I had this set up was, well, Windows 95 setup was because of DOS game compatibility, right? NT, for all intents and purposes, doesn't really have good DOS game support, but basic applications work fine. Yeah, dude. Good old FM synthesis. Yeah, so this is running in a 320 by 400 VESA mode, because the Matrox Millennium actually has very good support for these graphics modes, and DOS video modes in general it's very good with. So it's a good choice for DOS gaming, actually. But yeah, as you can see, it's running nice and smooth. Yeah, dude, this game's great. This is one of those games that I think anyone who's remotely a fan of first-person shooters should check out. It's just a classic. It's a lot of fun. It's got great level design. The main game this would have been competing with at the time would be Quake and Doom. And Quake didn't really have this kind of interactability going on, you know. But it did have like the full 3D thing going, so it was still certainly an impressive game. It's just impressive for different reasons. I would say in a lot of ways, both of these games are on pretty equal footing in terms of what the technology was like at the time. And here's the other thing too. Notice how we have like a spiral staircase here, rooms on top of rooms. That was a new thing. I mean, again, Quake kind of had that going on because it was a fully 3D game, but compared to Doom, man, that's totally blew it out of the water. There's no contrast. Anyways, you get the idea. Great game, so played by everyone. And yeah, so one more game I want to check out today before we call it a video is Sega Rally Championship. Now, this one was important to me because, you know, I had a feeling it would be a good test for our Voodoo 3D accelerator, right? Which, as you can see, does detect. And it's just a great game in general. It's short, but it's good, you know, it's a classic, man. Great music.
Sega Rally Championship.
Yeah, man. Sega was on top of the world in the 90s in terms of like their arcade division and stuff. They just released so many great arcade games. This is a pretty competent PC port, all things considered.
2, 1, go, go.
Alright, so here we are. Yeah, as you can see, man, it's running smooth. Despite the heavy underutilization of the processor. Now, this is definitely a game where you'd be better off on a Pentium Classic or an MMX or something. But, no, man, the Pentium Pro's handling it like a champ. Runs great. And it's a good test for the Voodoo card because we have all the fancy graphical effects going on, like the bilinear filtering and fog and all that. This was all like super impressive for its time, believe it or not. I mean, Voodoo cards were simply the best when they were out. Nothing else could really compete with them in the PC world, so they had very good support in games. The physics are super satisfying. Like, they're like the perfect blend between arcadey but also simcade. And so, like, you have like the feeling of simulation to an extent, but it's still an arcade game, and it's a lot of fun, man. Just controlling cars in this game is super satisfying. Yeah, man, this is a classic. It's a very short game. It doesn't have a lot of content. It's only a few tracks, not that many cars. But it's totally worth playing if you get the chance. Whether it's the PC version or Saturn or wherever. Especially in arcade. If you ever come across an arcade machine, definitely give it a shot. It's just a classic game. But yeah, so that's about going to wrap it up for this video. I know it's very different compared to what I normally make. Much more technical, much more involved. I hope it wasn't too overwhelming for you, but if it was, please let me know and I'll definitely adjust my philosophy going forward. But yeah, I mean, despite the weird issues we ran into, I personally had a lot of fun. You know, I definitely learned a bit here. I learned to be more careful about my hardware configuration and just pay more attention to stuff so I don't run into weird problems. But yeah, so thanks for watching. I appreciate your support as always, and I hope you come by again for the next part of this video where I'll be actually installing Windows NT 4, the primary focus of this computer. So Hope to see you guys then. Take care.